What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to my channel. So about a week ago, I posted on my Instagram stories if I should do more of a thrifting video or more of a video related to photography. And it seemed pretty equal, but there's a little more on the photography side, so I'd figure I'd try a new type of video. So today I'm gonna be showing you guys how I personally edit all of my Instagram pictures that you see on Lightroom. I personally like to use Lightroom over Photoshop just because it's the first program that I learned on. So it's a lot easier for me to get around compared to Photoshop. But when it comes to those tedious things with healing skin and fixing any type of blemishes like that, sometimes I do like to bring it into Photoshop because it's a lot more precise than Lightroom. And before we get started, I want to point out that I am using a new audio setup compared to the last video that you guys saw. Let me know in the comments how you guys like it, if it sounds better, the same, worse. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so now that we are in Lightroom, I already picked out two of the images that I'm going to be showing you guys how I edit. So let's go ahead and click on the first one and then go into the develop tab. And so what I start with when I'm editing my photos is I look for one of my presets that I've made, one of the many that I have, like 17 of them. So this one, I'm gonna use a darker preset. And after I choose the preset, of course, I never leave it at just that. I always tweak them from there on out. So the first thing I do is I go down to the transform tab right here and I click on level. What this is gonna do is pretty much gonna straighten out your image to what it thinks it should be at. And if you guys don't like how it turns out, then you can click back on off and then it'll reset that. Next thing is I go all the way up to the top and I mess with the exposure. For this one, it's a little bit dark even though I'm going for a darker feel to it. So I'm gonna bump up the exposure just a little bit. The contrast I always put up about +5 or +10. Also a heads up, I shoot all of my pictures in a standard picture profile, so it's pretty level on the contrast and the saturation. I'd say it's not too saturated or not too contrasty. So when I bring it into post, I don't have to do any dramatic changes. All right, so now we're gonna go on to the highlights and the whites. The first thing that I look at when I'm messing with these is the skin tone. I would say that's the most important thing when you're shooting a model, is to make sure you're focusing on how the skin looks when you're changing all of these. Looks pretty good to me so far. And then on the shadows and the blacks, I'm gonna probably leave it just around there. Next is the tone curve. I don't really mess with this too dramatically. I just make sure these 2 points on the end are touching the corners. And I start with the shadows and the blacks and I maybe bring it down just a little bit, or if I want a little bit of fade, then I'll bring it up just a little bit. And on the whites and the highlights, I usually leave it around the same or bring it down just a little bit so you get some type of fade on the highlights. Next is the hues, saturation, and luminance. The only thing I really mess with on the hues is sometimes the orange, reds, and yellows to mess with the skin tone, and the blues and aquas. The purples and magentas, I usually leave those down at 0, and these ones I usually bring it a little bit more towards the teal side, and then I also desaturate the blues, along with a lot of other colors. With the oranges, I don't really mess with too much, also with the reds, just because when you start to bring down the saturation, it makes the skin tone look really weird, so I leave that around here. The luminance, I only mess with if, I'm gonna set those back to 0, only mess with these if the skin tone anywhere has some weird shadows or it's really bright on the skin. Then I'm gonna mess with the luminance, make it brighter or darker, depends on the photo. Next thing is split toning. Depending on if I want to make the photo a lot warmer or a lot colder, I'll add some warmth into the shadows, and then I'll use the balance slider to bring in more or take out some. But for this photo, I like it a little bit more on the colder side, so I'm gonna leave it at this. Next is the sharpening. So for the sharpening, I always leave it at 60 no matter the image. I feel like this is almost like the perfect number to stay around. It doesn't add too much to where it makes your image look overly sharpened, and you always want to add a little bit, I feel, to make it enhanced a little bit better than it already is in camera. And then I leave the masking at 30. Noise reduction I don't really use unless I'm shooting in a low light condition where I have to shoot at a really low aperture and I have to shoot at a high ISO. But for this image, it's only at 200 ISO, so we're not gonna worry about that. Under lens corrections, you're gonna want to remove chromatic aberration, and sometimes I like to enable profile corrections. This fixes any distorting around the edges and it takes away any in-camera vignetting. So if you guys don't like the in-camera vignetting, or if you're shooting a really wide focal length, then you're gonna wanna click this and then select the lens that you used for the image. And then you could always add back some vignetting if you just wanted to get rid of the distortion. But for this one, I'm gonna go ahead and leave it as is. We already messed with the transform tab. For grain, I always add a little bit of grain into the image just so it gives the photo a little more structure than it already has. And for the dehaze, sometimes I add maybe +5 or just leave it at 0. What this does is it kind of takes away any type of fade that you have in the image, so it makes it a lot more cleaner and a lot more contrasty, I guess you could say. And the last part that I do on this tab is going to be the camera calibration. What I do here is mess with the hues and the saturations to get that perfect skin tone that you're looking for on the image. I always boost up the red hue towards the yellow side and the greens towards the greener side, not the yellow. And then the blue, sometimes I'll leave it around 0 or bring it down just a little bit to get a little bit more reds in the skin. And then depending on what camera profile you're shooting on, you can always add some saturation if you're looking for some more reds or some more oranges in the skin tone. A lot of people usually stop here and then they bring their image into Photoshop. I tend to edit all my skin in Lightroom. It's a lot easier for me just because I learned on Lightroom before Photoshop. So you go ahead and click on your spot removal tool, and this is going to be used to take away any blemishes or acne on the skin. So you can change the brush size if you're using a mouse just by scrolling down, and then you want to keep it on heal, not clone, just so it's a lot cleaner when it's sampling from different areas. So we're going to go ahead and go quickly over some of these spots just to clean up the image, make it look a little bit better. Not gonna do too much just for the sake of the video. Alright, so let's say I want to stop there. That looks pretty good to me. If you want to press H on the keyboard, this is gonna show up all the edits that you did so far. And then if you want to click on one, you can rearrange where it sampled from. If it selected somewhere out of the skin, maybe on the background. And then if you want to bring it back to where you had it, then hold Command and press Z. That's gonna remove the spot removal, or it's gonna remove anything, any type of edit you did to the image. Next thing I like to do is come over to the brush tool. I have a skin preset that I made. It's pretty simple. All it does is brings down the clarity and ups the sharpness, and it tends to do the trick for me. So I just brush over the skin. Oh, and also make sure that this auto mask is checked, because if it's not checked, it's gonna pretty much go all in the hair, all in the eyebrows, it's the eyes and everything like that. So you wanna make sure that that's clicked, because when you press O on the keyboard, it'll show where you're painting it, and it's a lot cleaner. It tends to mask out where it thinks you should be editing the skin, I guess you could say. So you can leave that on or leave it off. I tend to just leave it off because it's a little bit less laggy for me. And then I paint over the majority of the skin, sometimes on the neck if it's in focus. And then you could always bring up the clarity back up just a little bit if it's looking a little bit too soft for your liking. And then I always come back out to the image and then press backspace on the keyboard to see before and after, see how it's looking. It's looking pretty good. You could tell that the blues are a little bit more on the aqua side or teal side, and then the skin is a lot more enhanced, a lot more contrast in the overall photo. And that's about pretty much everything that I do for the image. Maybe if I know I'm going to be posting this one on Instagram, I'll go over to the crop tool right here. Under the aspect ratio, you're going to select 4:3, and what this does is it crops it to what Instagram uses on the vertical images. So if you don't do this, you'll notice when you post it on Instagram, it will crop off a little bit on the top or the bottom just because it's not at a 4:3 ratio. So by doing this, you know exactly what you'll be posting, and then you just press enter when you find that crop. And then for exporting, you're gonna hold Command Shift and press E. That's gonna be a shortcut to exporting. Then you're gonna wanna choose the file you want to save to. I'm gonna choose my desktop, and then I'm gonna rename it to a custom name. I like to do this so I can keep them all organized. And then if you go down, I keep my image format under JPEG, quality up to 100, and resolution to 300. And then after exporting, I want to select do nothing instead of open in Photoshop or anything else, since I'm just gonna be editing on Lightroom. And then click export. And if you already have that image saved, like I already have an image under 001, if I wanna replace it, just click overwrite, or you could change the image name. So now we're gonna go on to the second photo. So for this one, I'm gonna be doing a little bit more of a warmer, brighter image, just to do something different than the first image that I showed you. So I'm gonna be selecting a warmer preset that I have under these 5 presets that I made, and I'm thinking about selling. I wanted to wait until my website was complete to release them, but if you guys think I should release them to the public, let me know and I'll figure out a way to do some type of emailing so you guys can get the files like that. So for this one, you could already tell that it's a lot warmer. The highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks are roughly the same as the last preset. It tends to work really well on all photos. I'm gonna bring up the exposure quite a bit since I want this to be bright and warmer. The next thing is I go all the way down to the transform tab, click on level, make sure it's all leveled out, and since I shot this one at a 27mm focal length, you can see that it's a little bent around the corners, a little distorted, so you're gonna want to click on enable profile corrections, then select the lens that you used, and you can tell that it cleaned up the image a lot better, and then you can bring back that vignetting if you personally like it. I'm gonna add just a little bit in there. And now back up to the top, if you want to mess with any more exposure, you can zoom in, because you always want to make sure that when you're messing with the exposure, you're not changing the way their skin tone looks. So make sure to pay attention to that very closely. I'm gonna bring up the whites and the highlights just a little bit since I want an overall brighter picture. Maybe bring down the shadows, and the blacks look good right there. Sometimes I like to bring down the saturation and bring up the vibrance. By bringing up the vibrance, it helps bring out the colors that aren't too noticeable in the image, so it gives an overall better color spectrum of the photo. Next thing, we're gonna go down to the tone curve. I always make sure these 2 points are at the corners, and by lifting this up, I'll give it a little bit more fade. It looks like it's pretty good right there, just so I can bring out some more detail in the blacks and the shadows. Down to the colors, since I want this photo to be a little more warm, I'm gonna bring the yellows a little bit more to the red and the greens a little bit more to the yellows to get that warm effect. And the blues I usually always, like I said before, bring a little bit more to the teal and desaturate also. Again, with the red, orange, and yellow, I don't mess too much with this. If anything, I'll bring down the saturation on the yellows and then leave the orange and the reds around the same. The luminance, you can kind of tweak depending on the exposure of the image, how you want it to look. Next is the split toning. So this one I am going to be using this preset that Lightroom provides right here. This is going to be a slight warmer hue to use onto your shadows. I put the saturation around 20 just so it's not super dramatic, and then I use the balance sliding tool to bring more warmth into the image. Looks pretty good right there. Sharpening is the same, noise reduction is the same. I've already messed with the lens corrections and the transform. The grain, I'm gonna keep that at the same. And down at the camera calibration, I didn't do too much on this image. I might bring the reds a little more in, so I'll bring the blues more to the teal. So with the red hues, I brought it just a little bit up to the yellow, and I left everything about the same. So next we're going to crop for Instagram. You're gonna go under the crop tool and aspect down to the 4:3. I'm gonna make it a little bit smaller than it was shot. That looks pretty good right there. Press enter to crop it. And the next thing I'm going to do is edit the skin and the eyes. So here you can tell that the skin is really clean. Shout out to Marla for having that skin on fleek. So instead of messing with the skin, I'm gonna leave it as is, and I'm gonna go to iris enhance. And the first thing I do is I select that preset and apply it onto the eyes. But I don't use the preset that it's set to, just because it's a little dramatic for me. So I bring down the exposure, and the saturation I bring down just a little bit. One key tool that I do to help out a lot when it comes to enhancing the eyes is bringing up the sharpness, bringing up the highlights a little bit, and the whites just a little bit. And it seems to do the trick for me every single time. Go down to this little button right here. This is gonna show the before and after of applying. So you can tell that it's not anything too crazy, but it does do the trick. You can always zoom out and see if you like it or if it's a little bit too much for you. And that looks pretty good to me. So we're gonna zoom back out, and instead of using this spot removal tool for acne, you can also use it to take out any garbage or any spray paint, for example right here, that we'll be taking out. just to make the image a lot cleaner. So if you zoom in here, you can make the brush size a lot smaller, and then you get a sample of it. Roughly going over it for the video. And then zoom out, and you could hold spacebar and drag so you don't have to zoom back out and zoom back in, and move around the selection just so it's sampling the right area so it looks pretty natural. And then if that looks good to you, then go ahead and zoom back out, view it, and you can tell that looks a lot better. If you press the backspace button, then you can see the difference in the image. It's a lot brighter, it's a lot warmer, it has a little bit more red magenta into it. If I want to fix that, you just go over to the tint, push it 1 or 2 times towards the green, maybe just once. That looks pretty good to me, and it looks a lot cleaner with that X removed. Of course you got to remove the other one, but other than that, that's pretty much everything that I do to my images. I'm gonna go ahead and export this one, so hold Command Shift, press E. I'm gonna also have this go to the desktop. I'm gonna change it to 002 since it's the second image that I edited, and export. So that's pretty much everything that I do to my images. I don't like to change the colors or the exposure or anything too dramatically. When I'm shooting on my camera, I try to aim for the best possible image I can get out of camera, so when I bring it into post, I only have to tweak it just a little bit when it comes to exposure or fixing the skin or anything like that, just so it's a lot less work when you bring it in here to try and figure out what you need to fix on the image. And like I said before, I do have these 5 presets that I'm thinking about selling, so let me know if you guys like the preset that I used on this image. So thank you guys so much for checking out this video. I hope it helped you out if you're just starting on editing in Lightroom, or if you've always been editing in Lightroom and you saw something new that I did that might help you out. So if it did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more of these types of videos. And if you guys had any questions on what I did in Lightroom, feel free to comment below and I'll get back to you guys and help you out. And yeah, so I'll see you guys in the next video.